Bear with me for a minute. And happy Sunday, and thanks so much for joining us. Okay, we are all set. Ed, it's all yours. Take it away.
Good afternoon. Welcome to Reparations Speaking the Word. This series focuses on documents that address the purpose, meanings, and scope of reparations. Each hour-long event will feature meditative readings of documents, historical and present, private and political, important testaments to specific and often overlapping groups of persons. These texts will be performed antiphonally by solo voice. Join us to listen, learn, meditate, and each in his or her own way to act. We welcome all present. This evening is the first in the series. We begin with a bill that has been introduced to Congress for each of the last 30 years. HR40, Commission to Study and Develop Reparation Proposals for African Americans. Establishing a context for the bill is Dr. Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream. Reverend King's stirring proclamation was delivered at the Lincoln Memorial before 2,500 people, 250,000 people. The occasion marked the 100th year anniversary of Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. Officially called the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, the August 28, 1963 gathering combined two movements: an ongoing drive since the mid-40s for improved economic and job opportunities for Black Americans, and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference's plan for a public protest against the civil rights violations that occurred earlier that year in Birmingham, in what has since become known as the Children's Crusade. The march was originally to conclude at the Capitol. Out of respect for sitting legislators, the march was moved to conclude at the Lincoln Memorial. Join us now, 58 years later, as we listen to Dr. King.
I am happy to join with you today in what will go down in history as the greatest demonstration for freedom in the history of our nation. 50 years ago, a great American, in whose symbolic shadow we stand today, signed the Emancipation Proclamation. This momentous decree came as a great beacon light of hope to millions of Negro slaves who had been seared in the flames of withering injustice. It came as a joyous daybreak to end the long night of captivity. But 100 years later, the Negro still is not free. 100 years later, the life of the Negro is still sadly crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination. 100 years later, the Negro lives on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. 100 years later, the Negro is still languished in the corners of American society and finds himself in exile in his own land. So we have come here today to dramatize a shameful condition.
The late Representative John Conyers, Democrat from Michigan, had introduced the bill into Congress every year since 1989. Following his death in 2019, Representative Sheila Jackson Lee continued his action, first introducing the bill in the 2017-2018 Congress 115. On April 1st, 2021, after 30 years, the House of Representatives Judiciary Committee voted to move HR40, the Commission to Study and Develop Reparation Proposals for African Americans Act, to the House floor for the first time for full consideration. The bill's title refers to the first federally documented act of reparation, Tecumseh Sherman, General Tecumseh Sherman's Field Order Number 15, colloquially known as 40 Acres and a Mule. Following the assassination of Abraham Lincoln in April of 1865, his successor canceled this order, and the land in question reverted to the original enslaved holders. We present H.R. 40, Commission to Study and Develop Reparation Proposals for African Americans.
A bill to address the fundamental injustice, cruelty, brutality, and inhumanity of slavery in the United States and the 13 American colonies between 1619 and 1865, and to establish a commission to study and consider a national apology and proposal for reparations for the institution of slavery, its subsequent de jure and de facto racial and economic discrimination against African Americans, and the impact of these forces on living African Americans, to make recommendations to the Congress on appropriate remedies and for other purposes. Be it enacted by the Senate and the House of Representatives of the United States of America in Congress assembled. Section 2, Findings and Purpose. A, Findings. The Congress finds that 1, approximately 4 million Africans and their descendants were enslaved in the United States and colonies that became the United States from 1619 to 1865. 2, the institution of slavery was constitutionally and statutorily sanctioned by the government of the United States from 1789 through 1865. 3, the slavery that flourished in the United States constituted an immoral and inhumane deprivation of Africans' life, liberty, African citizenship rights, and cultural heritage, and denied them fruits of their own labor. 4, a preponderance of scholarly, legal, community, evidentiary documentation, and popular culture markers constitute the basis for inquiry into the ongoing effects of the institution of slavery and its legacy of persistent systemic structures of the discrimination on African Americans and society in the United States. And 5, following the abolition of slavery, the United States government at the federal, state, and local level continued to perpetuate, condone, and often profit from practices that continued to brutalize and disadvantage African Americans, including sharecropping, convict leasing, Jim Crow, redlining, unequal education, and disproportionate treatment at the hands of the criminal justice system. And 6, as a result of the historic and continued discrimination, African Americans continue to suffer debilitating economic, educational, and health hardships, including, but not limited to, having nearly 1 million Black people incarcerated, an unemployment rate more than twice the current white unemployment rate, an average of less than 1/16 of the wealth of white families, a disparity which has worsened, not improved over time.
In a sense, we've come to our nation's capital to cash a check. When the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. This note was a promise that all men, yes, Black men as well as white men, would be guaranteed the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It is obvious today that America has defaulted on this promissory note insofar as her citizens of color are concerned. Instead of honoring this sacred obligation, America has given the Negro people a bad check, a check which has come back marked insufficient funds. But we refuse to believe that the bank of justice is bankrupt. We refuse to believe that there are insufficient funds in the great vaults of opportunity of this nation. So we have come to cash this check, a check that will give us, upon demand, the riches of freedom and the security of justice. We have also come to this hallowed spot to remind America of the fierce urgency of now. This is no time to engage in the luxury of cooling off or to take the tranquilizing drug of gradualism.
HR40, purpose. B, purpose. The purpose of this act is to establish a commission to study and develop reparation proposals for African Americans as a result of, 1, the institution of slavery, which included both transatlantic and domestic trade, which existed from 1565 in colonial Florida and from 1619 through 1865 within the other colonies that became the United States, and which included the federal and state governments which constitutionally and statutorily supported the institution of slavery. 2, the de jure and de facto discrimination against freed slaves and their descendants from the end of the Civil War to the present, including economic, political, educational, and social discrimination. 3, the lingering negative effects of the institution of slavery and the discrimination described in paragraphs 1 and 2 on living African Americans and on society in the United States. 4, the manner in which textual and digital instructional resources and technologies are being used to deny the inhumanity of slavery and the crime against humanity of the people of African descent in the United States. 5, the role of Northern complicity in the Southern-based institution of slavery. 6, the direct benefits to societal institutions, public and private, including higher education, corporations, religious and associational. 7, and thus recommend appropriate ways to educate the American public of the Commission's findings. 8, and thus recommend appropriate remedies in consideration of the Commission's findings on the matters described in paragraphs 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, and 9. Submit to the Congress the results of such examination together with such recommendations.
If passed in both chambers, This bill will establish a commission to study reparations and to demonstrate to Congress the U.S. government's role in the enslavement and systemic disenfranchisement of African Americans. The bill does not lay out provisions for the shape the reparations will take or could take, whether in the form of direct cash payments or safety net programs. As a side note, we circle back to 1955 in Montgomery, Alabama, following the brutal death and killing of Emmett Till. Rosa Parks, as a result, who some have called the first lady of civil rights, after that event initiated the Montgomery bus boycott, which took place in the city from December 5th, 1955 to December 20th, 1956, and is regarded as the first large-scale US demonstration against segregated apartheid society. Ms. Parks later worked in the office of Representative John Conyers from 1965 through 1988. Mr. Conyers was the first to introduce the bill 30 years ago.
Now is the time to make real the promises of democracy. Now is the time to rise from the dark and desolate valley of segregation to the sunlit path of racial justice. Now is the time to lift our nation from the quicksands of racial injustice to the solid rock of brotherhood. Now is the time to make justice a reality for all of God's children. It would be fatal for the nation to overlook the urgency of the moment. This sweltering summer of the Negro's legitimate discontent will not pass until there is an invigorating autumn of freedom and equality. 1963 is not an end, but a beginning. Those who hoped that the Negro needed to blow off steam and will now be content will have a rude awakening if the nation returns to business as usual. There will be neither rest nor tranquility in America until the Negro is granted his citizenship rights. The whirlwinds of revolt will continue to shake the foundations of our nation until the bright day of justice emerges.
HR 40, Section 3, Establishment and Duties. A, Establishment. There is established the Commission to study and develop reparation proposals for African Americans, hereinafter in this act referred to as the Commission. B, Duties. The Commission shall perform the following duties. 1, identify, compile, and synthesize the relevant corpus of evidentiary documentation of the institution of slavery, which existed within the United States and the colonies that became the United States from 1619 through 1865. The Commission's documentation and examination shall include, but not be limited to, the facts related to A, the capture and procurement of Africans. B, the transport of Africans to the United States and the colonies that became the United States for the purpose of enslavement, including their treatment during transport. C, the sale and acquisition of Africans as chattel property in interstate and intrastate commerce. D, the treatment of African slaves in the colonies and the United States, including the deprivation of their freedom, exploitation of their labor, and destruction of their culture, language, religion, and families. And E, the extensive denial of humanity, sexual abuse, and chattelization of persons.
But There is something I must say to my people who stand on the warm threshold which leads into the palace of justice. In the process of gaining our rightful place, we must not be guilty of wrongful deeds. Let us not seek to satisfy our thirst for freedom by drinking from the cup of bitterness and hatred. We must forever conduct our struggle on the high plane of dignity and discipline. We must not allow our creative protest to degenerate into physical violence. Again and again, we must rise to the majestic heights of meeting physical force with soul force. The marvelous new militancy which has engulfed the Negro community must not lead us to a distrust of all white people. For many of our white brothers, as evidenced by their presence here today, have come to realize that their destiny is tied up with our destiny. And they have come to realize that their freedom is inextricably bound to our freedom. We cannot walk alone. And as we walk, we must make the pledge that we shall march ahead. We cannot turn back. There are those who are asking the devotees of civil rights, when will you be satisfied? We can never be satisfied as long as the Negro is the victim of the unspeakable horrors of police brutality. We can never be satisfied as long as our bodies, heavy with the fatigue of travel, cannot gain lodging in the motels of the highways and the hotels of the cities. We cannot be satisfied as long as the Negro's basic mobility is from a smaller ghetto to a larger one. We can never be satisfied as long as our children are stripped of their selfhood and robbed of their dignity by signs stating, "For whites only." We cannot be satisfied as long as a Negro in Mississippi cannot vote and a Negro in New York believes he has nothing for which to vote. No, we are not satisfied, and we will not be satisfied until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream.
HR40, purpose. 2, the role which federal and state governments of the United States supported the institution of slavery in constitutional and statutory provisions, including the extent to which governments prevented, opposed, or restricted efforts of formerly enslaved Africans and their descendants to repatriate to their homeland. 3, the federal and state laws that discriminated against formerly enslaved Africans and their descendants who were deemed United States citizens from 1868 to the present. 4, the other forms of discrimination in public and private sectors against freed African slaves and their descendants who were deemed United States citizens from 1868 to the present, including redlining, educational funding discrepancies, and predatory financial practices. 5, the lingering negative effects of the institution of slavery and the matters described in paragraphs 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 on living African Americans and on society in the United States.
The concluding portion of Dr. King's address, the portion for which he is best known and this speech the best known, was largely extemporaneous. At this point, Mahalia Jackson, on the podium with Dr. King, called out, quote, Tell them about the dream, Martin. Tell them about the dream.
I am not unmindful that some of you have come here out of great trials and tribulations. Some of you have come fresh from narrow jail cells. Some of you have come from areas where your quest for freedom left you battered by the storms of persecution and staggered by the winds of police brutality. You have been the veterans of creative suffering. Continue to work with the faith that unearned suffering is redemptive. Go back to Mississippi, go back to Alabama, go back to South Carolina, go back to Georgia, go back to Louisiana, go back to the slums and ghettos of our northern cities, knowing that somehow this situation can and will be changed. Let us not wallow in the valley of despair. I say to you today, my friends, so even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that one day, even the state of Mississippi, a state sweltering with the heat of injustice, sweltering with the heat of oppression, will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character.
HR40, purpose. 6, recommend appropriate ways to educate the American public of the Commission's findings. 7, recommend appropriate remedies in consideration of the Commission's findings on these matters described in paragraphs 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. In making such recommendations, the Commission shall address, among other issues, the following questions. A, how such recommendations comport with international standards for remedy for wrongs and injuries caused by the state that include full reparations and special measures as understood by various relevant international protocols, laws, and findings. B, how the government of the United States will offer a formal apology on behalf of the people of the United States for the perpetuation of gross human rights violations and crimes against humanity on African slaves and their descendants. C, how federal laws and policies that continue to disproportionately and negatively affect African Americans as a group and those that perpetuate the lingering effects materially and psychosocial can be eliminated.
I have a dream today. I have a dream that one day every valley shall be exalted, every hill and mountain shall be made low, the rough places will be made plain, and the crooked places will be made straight, and the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together. This is our hope. This is the faith that I will go back to the South with. With this faith, we will be able to hew out of the mountain of despair a stone of hope. With this faith, we will be able to transform the jangling discords of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. With this faith, we will be able to work together, to pray together, to struggle together, to go to jail together, to stand up for freedom together, knowing that we will be free one day. This will be the day when all of God's children will be able to sing with new meaning. My country, 'tis of thee. Sweet land of liberty, of thee I sing. Land where my fathers died, land of the pilgrim's pride, from every mountainside, let freedom ring.
B, how the injuries resulting from matters described in paragraphs 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 can be reversed and provide appropriate policies, programs, projects, and recommendations for the purpose of reversing the injuries. E, how, in consideration of the Commission's findings, any form of compensation to the descendants of African slaves is calculated. F, what form of compensation should be awarded, what instrumentalities, and who should be eligible for such compensation. G, how, in consideration of the Commission's findings, any other forms of rehabilitation or restitution to African descendants is warranted, and what the form and scope of those measures should take.
HR40 was voted out of committee, usually the first step towards legislation. Voted out of committee for the first time in 30 years on April 15th, 2021. 25 Democrats, 17 Republicans. On summer recess, as Congress is, we wait to see what will happen in the forthcoming year.
And if America is to be a great nation, this must become true. So let freedom ring from the prodigious hilltops of New Hampshire. Let freedom ring from the mighty mountains of New York. Let freedom ring from the heightening Alleghenies of Pennsylvania. Let freedom ring from the snow-capped Rockies of Colorado. Let freedom ring from the curvaceous slopes of California. But not only that, let freedom ring from the Stone Mountain of Georgia. Let freedom ring from Lookout Mountain of Tennessee. Let freedom ring from every hill and molehill of Mississippi, from every mountainside. Let freedom ring. And when this happens, and when we allow freedom ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, Black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last.
The Reverend Dr. King was something of an afterthought for this march, the planning of which had gone on, as I said earlier, for probably 2 decades. he spoke his address before an assembled crowd of 250,000 people. At his funeral, April 9th, 1968, approximately the same number of persons, over 200,000, followed in a march of 4 miles down the streets following his casket. This evening, we have heard Tasha Hawk and Kyle Hackett proclaim the words. There are many more words and many more people. Thank you this evening for joining us. We invite you to return again in about a month for the second of the series. Robert, it's all yours.
Ed, I had to step away for just a minute. Did you want to take some questions?
It's all yours. I will, we have a few minutes. I promised us an hour. If you feel it appropriate and if you want to take questions, Tasha and Kyle are here also.
Oh, sure. Yeah, so thank you so much for joining us today, our participants. And then also thanks so much for our panel for their presentation and to learn more about this interesting topic that's been getting a lot of news media attention recently. So we're live streaming this on Facebook, and there's been quite a debate, people pro and con going back and forth on the Facebook page. Just for any one of you, what's your response to people who say, well, my ancestors never owned any slaves, or, I immigrated over here, 100 years ago, so that I should be exempt from all this type of stuff. Any response to that? That seems like the most common argument against reparations. And our organization is not pro or con this topic. We just thought it was a great opportunity to give people the opportunity to talk and learn more about it, because it is such an important topic. But any thoughts on the response of people saying, well, my ancestors weren't involved in any of this slavery stuff, so why should I have to be held responsible? I'm sure you hear that all the time.
And I would say, and I'm sure that Tasha and Kyle have their own opinions. I don't think we know enough to make any decisions about any of this, which is why we're doing what we're doing. We're trying to demonstrate the knowledge to read the text, to hear the text, and have a sense that we as Americans have a shared history. Most of us do not know what that shared history consists of.
Yeah, Kyle, I noticed in your part of the program you talked about that. There's some of this is just studying this and analyzing this and reviewing. It's not saying that, oh, everyone's going to get this or that or whatnot. That hasn't even gotten that far yet. Is that a fair assessment, Kyle?
Yeah, absolutely. And I just have to say that I really am thrilled to see the spirited Q&A comments and responses here as well. I'm thrilled that we have carved out time for these types of conversations. And, that is one of the large takeaways here, right? We say HR40. There's so many that don't even know what that means, right? It in some ways becomes insider talk and knowledge. But at the same time, understanding too, that this may not be a problem to be solved. It may be just the beginning. It's a proposal, and thinking about it perhaps more as a catastrophe than a problem could perhaps provide appropriate solutions and so forth. And so for me too, it's been great to kind of study the bill. I knew about it, but I didn't necessarily know the formal language in it. And so just spending time with the word, the text, really helped me understand intentions and the histories on a formal timeline as described in that document. But, again, it's still a proposal, and there's so much more that must be unpacked.
I will, Tasha, permit me. I will also add the United States has a long extended history of reparative and restorative justice actions, including the Indigenous, Native Americans, the Japanese, a variety of persons, including the Inuits in the First Peoples of Canada. So this is, and we will be looking at those texts as we move forward in the series.
Thank you, Ed, and thank you, Kyle. My mind is buzzing with a number of things right now. I think one of the interesting things about this project and the work that we're doing through this series is that we don't presume to come with answers. We're embarking with a spirit of curiosity and intentionality around all of the issues that span reparations, racial equity, and social justice. And I do want to take a moment just to give presence to a few specific questions before I speak from myself personally and how I see these things. And so a few questions that have come up in the Q&A: how can you punish people for crimes they didn't commit? Inherited guilt is a horrible concept. Another question: will Obama and Harris receive reparations? How would you distribute reparations? What do you think about the issue of compensated emancipation? And so to all of these questions, I am confident in saying, I don't know. I don't know. And I think for me, learning about HR40 through this project, what really struck me was the intention to say simply, we need to take a stronger look. We need to have a focus. We need to have an intention to unpack all of this. And when I think about those issues, here I am, a halfway to 108 in the year 2021, living in a very rural context with my family. I have so much curiosity about what reparations could look like. I think that we, as a capitalist society, get really caught up in immediately signaling some financial reparations. I think that reparations can go far beyond that. I think that that could be a part of that. I'm not an economist, so I don't know how that would really work, but I have curiosity about it. And I feel as a person who has lived a life that has been tremendously and positively impacted by my privilege, I would consider the opportunity to provide reparations, even not being someone who has directly enslaved people. I would greet that opportunity as a gift for myself.
If I may come back to this, the United States does have a history of compensating emancipation. The first of the two Emancipation Proclamations, probably most people don't remember that there were two. The DC first Emancipation Proclamation, which was not Lincoln's, this was 6 or 7 months ahead of time. It was the DC Compensated Emancipation Proclamation, and it compensated the owners of the enslaved persons. It did not compensate the enslaved themselves. Abraham Lincoln, a few months later, in his second inaugural address, actually addresses in language the compensation owed to those who had been enslaved. But I thank Tasha for reminding all of us that these are just the texts, and we will be looking at other persons and other testimonies in terms of the United States' relationships to the nations of the Indigenous and a variety of different persons. Robert, again, thank you.
Oh, no problem. So yeah, it's interesting that someone said this is a divisive issue. Well, you know, at one point in time, emancipation was a divisive issue. At one point in time, women's suffrage was a divisive issue. One time, civil rights, you know, the voting rights of the African Americans was a divisive issue, and we've moved beyond that. And again, I'm not saying I'm pro or con against it. It's just it is interesting that to me, my own personal opinion is that this topic has come up a lot more in the past few years than say it was 10 years ago. Do any of the three of you kind of see like a turning point or a tipping point than when an event that took place or something that transpired where this is now kind of more out in the open being discussed than it was? You know, again, in my opinion, this is more of a topic that's discussed more mainstream now than it was 5 or 10 years ago. Is that do you think the same? And if so, was there an event that happened that caused it to become discussed
Dr.
more?
Martin Luther King's book, 63 book, Part of the Leaping Right In, Why We Can't Wait, actually uses the word genocide. 40 years before the United Nations does, it uses the word genocide specifically related to the indigenous Native Americans of the country. Reading him and reading Abraham Lincoln's second inaugural was for me kind of the switch.
Okay.
This is
Kyle and Tasha, what about for the two of you? Any particular tipping point for you when you think this might have gotten more attention than it did in the past?
Oh, I can jump in just to mention the more recent present and the impact of the pandemic that it's had, you know, particularly on people of color, you know, throughout the past year and a half, I think exposes that underbelly that has been in critical discourse, just often not as mainstream, I think, as you described. And I think that kind of pressure in some ways and perfect storm with politics, like all those intersections brewing together, really is putting a spotlight on exactly those that have access and those that don't, those that have had, as many folks have pointed out in the comments, generational wealth or just certain access to things sooner. And I think that with that, you know, and what I'm learning from the reparations is trying to find this notion of value. Is that what is currency? How you know, how is that quantifiable, right? Trying to wrap our head around that. And that remains a question, even after reading the bill, which, you know, I remind everybody it's a proposal. But I remain a prisoner of hope with that, right? That this is in some ways planting the seed for possibility. And I do think that certainly this past year and a half has pressurized that, and it's been more visible to the public eye. These discrepancies, you know, the level of perhaps despair of not just individual, but group identities as well. So those are my kind of 2 cents.
Okay, well, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Tasha, what about yourself?
I can't pinpoint any specific tipping point. I do. What comes to mind is that with recent events, right? The murder of George Floyd. You know, there are so many other names that we could list there. Our civil unrest, the pandemic, and this idea that, you know, these are divisive topics. They actually don't have to be. They don't have to be divisive topics. I think that our opportunity in engaging in these dialogues is how to navigate these topics in a way that doesn't define them by division. Because we're not, nothing's going to get solved if we're all just trying to be right. We can either be right or we can solve the problem. And that's an intentional choice, right? And so what really struck me in that conversation was this is a divisive topic. No, it's a topic. How we engage with it makes it divisive or unifying. And that's a choice that we have to make.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, every topic is divisive. I mean, what topic is there 100% of people agree on? Nothing. I mean, that's just the
I
way.
like pineapple on pizza. People
Yeah.
freak out, right?
Exactly. Hold on, I did want to pull up something real quick. I just need a few seconds. Ed, anything else you want to share from either from the questions or from the Q&A?
Our next next in the series, I'm understanding that Mr. Kyle is going to be directing us, and we do have a variety of different texts that are. Kyle, would you like to talk a bit about what you're proposing?
Yeah, I'm not going to unveil exactly the specific text, what I'm proposing, but I do think it's important to think about, the word of Dr. King and the timeline and progression of his life and his views and how they changed over time. And so we will be referring to King as well in some of the future readings, the more radical King. And you'll be able to kind of see where we started here and how, things are changing, how America's changing, and really just a short amount of time, with the dates of the texts being probably 5 years or so apart. So that's kind of what's in store next. But I also want to have conversations about the idea of the message, the art form of delivering the word, the voice, lifting not just one voice, but every voice. And I think that is something I'm excited about. Where are the intersections of this idea of text, the voice as something to deliver a message, as in a way of art form? And so those are just little tidbits of perhaps what's next in store for the programming. But again, this also sense that people change over time as well. And so by referring to different texts from similar voices, we may be able to see that.
Tasha, how about you?
Specifically in what's coming up?
Plans that you are thinking?
Yeah, because of the professional work that I do, I have a lot of interest in researching and understanding historical legislative impacts on hiring and how equity and justice have been lacking in hiring processes. I'm interested in legislation that's been introduced around the Indian schools and where, that land awareness and understanding the experience of Indigenous peoples and how those legislative and policy issues have impacted them. Is that broad enough?
So we could start with the Supreme Court's Dred Scott decision. That's perfect. Robert, all yours.
Oh, I'll share some. So this is I always like to look at Google Trends to see what terms or words are trending over time. And so this is for reparations on Google. And you can see, 2004, there's obviously up and down depending on what's going on. So from 2004 to, say 2013, not really too much change. And then all of a sudden the past, say, 5-6 years, a lot more activity as far as people Googling this term and wanting to learn more about it. So just interesting. Again, it just seems like this is getting a lot more discussion, so to speak. What about on a personal level? How did the three of you get involved in this topic? Is it something you studied in school, or are you involved in this somehow in your work or your profession, or anything any of the three of you are able to share in that regard?
Kyle?
Yeah, so, this is a topic that I touch on and intersects my research practice, my art practice, studio practice as a painter. I'm dealing with issues of identity, the constructed image, social, cultural, structural forces that, kind of tap into and try to unpack history. And so it's been exciting and really a learning experience, also pairing and juxtaposing different texts as well, because with that juxtaposition is meaning. And I keep going back to the lyric, Common's lyric, I think in the opening song, where he says juxtaposition, and it's all about that kind of structures and meaning. And so like I'm thinking about that in my own artwork, and also just how I move through space as well, having lived in DC, Baltimore, during these charged political times.
Okay. Anybody else? Tasha, Ed?
I'll go. Professionally, I lead talent acquisition for a fintech scale up. And beyond that, I'm very involved in the art world. Like Kyle, I was, have an art practice. And here in the Twin Cities, I'm working with Northeast Sculpture Gallery Factory that has a social justice billboard project. And so they have secured the 3 billboards facing George Floyd Memorial and are amplifying artwork by Black, Latinx, and Indigenous artists through that platform in a community space as that memorial has become. I'm very active in the B Corporation movement. If you don't know about it, it's B, the letter B Corporation, which is a certification awarded to organizations that conduct themselves at the highest standards across a number of important dimensions. And I think all of these things come together in highlighting the need for, again, intentional, I probably overused that word, but intentional and focused education, and then action in social justice and racial equity work.
Okay. Ed, anything to add to that?
Really quickly, I've been in DC since 1986, where I've lived here. DC has taught me everything that I know, I say with humility. When I first realized that Woodrow Wilson, a segregationist, had a bridge that ended in an unmarked, you can't say cemetery because the enslaved were not buried, they were left. When that Woodrow Wilson had a bridge who ended in that marked space with no recognition of it, and Frederick Douglass, on the other hand, a marshal of DC, there was no public address to that. And I began to think about it. So here I am.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Okay, well, let's see. I guess we've run over our time a little bit, so I don't want to keep you too long. Any parting thoughts from anyone, or anything else you want to add before we sign off for the day?
Please come again, bring your friends, bring your texts.
Yeah, appreciate that. Okay, excellent. Well, thanks everyone. Thanks so much for joining us, and we look forward to continuing on. Ed has a couple other programs coming up in the near future. We'll be happy to send out that information, and hopefully you can join us for them. So everyone, have a great rest of your Sunday, a great weekend. Thanks to our panelists and to all of our participants for joining us today. Stay safe, and we will see you soon. Thanks everyone. Take care. Bye.
Bye.